33. Articulation. 31. That movement of the wand. All this appears in the handling of the concept of articulation. To demonstrate it, we must make a long detour. To understand how articulations, which are conventional, chapter 4, operate, we must once again go through the problem of the concept of nature. To avoid rushing directly into the center of the difficulty which many commentators on Rousseau have already well defined, we shall try, in a limited and prefatory way, to locate it in the essay. Already there it is formidable. 31. That movement of the wand. Let us begin with some simple certainties and choose some propositions whose literal clarity leaves little in doubt. We read them in the first chapter. First proposition. Speech distinguishes man among the animals. These are the first words of the essay. Speech is also the first social institution. It is therefore not natural. It is natural to man, it belongs to his nature, to his essence, which is not, unlike that of animals, natural. Speech belongs to man, to the humanity of man. But Rousseau distinguishes between language langue and speech parole. The usage of speech is universally human, but languages are diverse. Language distinguishes nations from each other. One does not know where a man comes from until he has spoken. Out of usage and necessity, each learns the language of his own country. But what determines that this language is that of his country and not of another? In order to tell, it is necessary to go back to some principle that belongs to the locality itself and antedates its customs, for speech, being the first social institution, owes its form to natural causes alone. Essay, p. 5. Thus the natural causality of language splits itself into 1. Speech, the possibility of discourse in general, must have, as the first institution, only general natural causes, relationships between need and passion, etc. 2. But beyond the general existence of speech, one must account, by equally natural causes, for its forms. Speech, being the first social institution, owes its form to natural causes alone. It is the explication of the diversity of languages by physicality, geography, climate, etc. This double natural explanation announces the division of the essay in its first part, into what concerns language and what concerns languages. The first 7 chapters explain by natural causes language in general, or the primitive language, its origin and its decadence. With the 8th chapter, we pass from language to languages. General and local differences are explained by natural causes. How should this natural explanation be analyzed? Second proposition, as soon as one man was recognized by another as a sentient, thinking being similar to himself, the desire or need to communicate his feelings and thoughts made him seek the means to do so. Essay, p. 5. Desire or need, the home of two origins, southern or northern, is already assured. And Rousseau refuses, as he also does in the second discourse, to wonder if the language preceded the society as its condition, or conversely. He sees no solution, and no doubt no sense, to such a question. In the second discourse, confronted by the immense difficulty of the genealogy of language, almost giving up a natural and purely human explanation, Rousseau writes what is also implied in the essay, for myself, I am so aghast at the increasing difficulties which present themselves, and so well convinced of the almost demonstrable impossibility that languages should owe their original institution to merely human means, that I leave, to anyone who will undertake it, the discussion of the difficult problem, which was most necessary, the existence of society to the invention of language, or the invention of language to the establishment of society, p. 151, p. 179. Same gesture in the essay, one is given language and society at the same time, at the moment when the pure state of nature is crossed, when absolute dispersion is overcome for the first time. One attempts to seize the origin of language at the moment of this first crossing over. In the second discourse, we can still locate a footnote reference, a place is indicated for that long digression which would have been the essay. It is in the first part, immediately after the critique of Condillac and of those who, reasoning from the state of nature, transport their ideas taken from society. Rousseau knows that it is very difficult to find the resource of an explanation for the birth of languages in the pure state of nature and in the original dispersion. And he proposes a leap. We will suppose, however, that this first difficulty is obviated. Let us for a moment then take ourselves as being on the side of the vast space which must lie between a pure state of nature and that in which languages had become necessary, and, admitting their necessity, let us inquire how they could first be established. Here we have a new and worse difficulty to grapple with, p. 14, p. 1751. Let us for a moment then take ourselves as being on the side of the vast space. Up to what point? Not up to constituted society but up to the moment when the conditions for its birth are united. Between the pure state of nature and that moment a multitude of centuries, rhythmed by distinct steps. 47 but it is difficult to discern the stages. The difference among all Rousseau's texts is subtle, perhaps unstable, always problematic on this point. To the distinctions already located, we must, at the risk of complicating the debate, add the following specification, which concerns precisely the essay in its relationship to the discourse. Between the pure state of nature and society, Rousseau describes, both in the discourse and in the essay, an age of huts. And since that age is presented in chapter 9 of the essay as the primitive times, one might be tempted to think that the pure state of nature is radical one to it only in the second discourse, first part, the age of huts of the essay corresponding to the one that appeared after the pure state of nature in the second part of the discourse. Even though this hypothesis does not seem simply false and is in fact confirmed by many descriptive elements, it must be nuanced or complicated. As it is evoked in the essay, the age of huts is much closer to the pure state of nature. Speaking of primitive times, when the sparse human population had no more social structure than the family, no laws but those of nature, no language but that of gesture and some inarticulate sounds, Rousseau adds in a note, one consider primitive the period of time from the dispersion of men to any period of the human race that might be taken as determining an epoch. Essay, p. 31, n. 1. And certainly familial societies do not have the same status here as in the second part of the discourse. 48 The two accounts become similar, it seems, only at the moment when, after a revolution that we shall examine later, ties of another family are constituted, making possible love, morality, speech. It is only the close of chapter 9 of the essay that one may compare to the second part of the discourse. Let us for a moment then take ourselves as being on the side of the vast space and give ourselves the following hypothesis, starting from the state of pure nature, thanks to a certain reversal that we shall discuss later, man encounters man and recognizes him. Pity awakens and becomes active, he wishes to communicate. But at that moment man has just left nature. It is still by natural causes that the means of communication must be explained. Man can at first use only natural dispositions or instrumentis, the senses. Third proposition. Man must therefore act by his senses upon the senses of others. Hence the institution of sensate signs for the expression of thought. The inventors of language did not proceed rationally in this way, rather their instinct suggested the consequence of them. Essay, p. 5. We have two ways of working on the senses of others, movement and voice. Naturally, Rousseau does not wonder what means or instrument might mean, nor, as he does in Emile, p. 160, if voice is not itself a sort of movement. The action of movement is immediate through touching, or mediate through gesture. The first can function only within arm's length, while the other extends as far as the visual ray. Thus vision and hearing are the only passive organs of language among distinct disperses individuals. Essay, p6, italics added. The analysis of the instruments of language is therefore governed by the situation of pure dispersion which characterizes the state of nature. Language could have emerged only out of dispersion. The natural causes by which one explains it are not recognized as natural except in so far as they accord with the state of nature, which is determined by dispersion. This dispersion should no doubt be overcome by language, but, for that very reason, it determines the natural condition of language. The natural condition, it is remarkable that the original dispersion out of which language began continues to mark its milieu and essence. That language must traverse space, be obliged to be spaced, is not an accidental trait but the mark of its origin. In truth, dispersion will never be a past, a pre-linguistic situation in which language would certainly have been born only to break with it. The original dispersion leaves its mark within language. We shall have to verify it. Articulation, which seemingly introduces difference as an institution, has for ground and space the dispersion that is natural, space itself. At this point, the concept of nature becomes even more enigmatic, and if one does not want Rousseau to contradict himself at all, one must use a great deal of analysis and sympathy. The natural is first valorized and then disqualified, the original is also the inferior retained within the superior. The language of gesture and the language of voice, sight, and hearing, are equally natural. Nevertheless, one is more natural than the other, and because of this it is first and better. It is the language of gesture, which is more easy and depends less on conventions. Of course there can be conventions of the language of gestures. Rousseau alludes later to a gestural code. But that code is less remote from nature than is the spoken language. For that reason, Rousseau begins with praise for the language of gestures, although, further on, wishing to show the superiority of passion over need, he will place speech above gesture. This contradiction is only apparent. Natural immediacy is at once origin and end, but in the double sense of these words, birth and death, unfinished sketch, and finished perfection. From then on, all value is determined according to its proximity to an absolute nature. But as this concept is that of a polarized structure, proximity is a distancing. All the contradictions of the discourse are regulated, rendered necessary yet resolved, by this structure of the concept of nature. Before all determinations of a natural law, there is, effectively constraining the discourse, a law of the concept of nature. A contradiction regulated in this way appears in a flagrant manner when, praising the language of gesture, Rousseau speaks of love. Further on, he will say of this passion that it is at the origin of sung speech. Here, he makes drawing its best interpreter. To appeal to the eye in order to declare love is more natural, more expressive, more alive, at once more immediate and more alive, therefore more energetic, more present, more free. Thus resolving the entire contradiction, summing it up into its two poles, the essay begins with praise and concludes with condemnation of a mute sign. The first chapter exalts language without voice, that of glance and gesture, which Rousseau distinguishes from our gesticulation, thus one speaks more effectively to the eye than to the ear. Essay, phj. The last chapter depicts, at the other pole of history, the ultimate servitude of a society organized by the circulation of silent sign s. Societies have assumed their final form, no longer is anything changed except by arms and cash. And since there is nothing to say to people besides give money, it is said with placards on street corners or by soldiers in their homes. Essay, p. 72j. The mute sign is a sign of liberty when it expresses within immediacy, then, what it expresses and he who expresses himself through it are properly present. There is neither deed nor anonymity. The mute sign signifies slavery when representative media has invaded the entire system of signification, then, through infinite circulation and references, from sign to sign and from representer to representer, the self-sameness proper of presense has no longer a place, no one is there for anyone, not even for himself, one can no longer dispose of meaning, one can no longer stop it, it is carried into an endless movement of signification. The system of the sign has no outside. As it is speech that has opened this endless movement of signification, thus constantly risking the loss of signification, it is tempting to return to an archaeological moment, a first moment of sign without speech, when passion, beyond need but short of articulation and difference, expresses itself in an unheard of way, an immediate sign. Although the language of gesture and spoken language are equally natural, still the first is easier 49 and depends less upon conventions. For more things affect our eyes than our ears. Also, visual forms are more varied than sounds, and more expressive, saying more in less time. Love, it is said, was the inventor of drawing. It might also have invented speech, though less happily. Not being very well pleased with it, it disdains it, it has livelier ways of expressing itself. How she could say things to her beloved, who traced his shadow with such pleasure. What sounds might she use to render this movement of the magic wand? Essay, p6. The movement of the magic wand that traces with so much pleasure does not fall outside of the body. Unlike the spoken or written sign, it does not cut itself off from the desiring body of the person who traces or from the immediately perceived image of the other. It is of course still an image which is traced at the tip of the wand, but an image that is not completely separated from the person it represents. What the drawing draws is almost present in person in his shadow. The distance from the shadow or from the wand is almost nothing. She who traces, holding, handling, now, the wand, is very close to touching what is very close to being the other itself, close by a minute difference, that small difference visibility, spacing, death is undoubtedly the origin of the sign and the breaking of immediacy, but it is in reducing it as much as possible that one marks the contours of signification. One thinks the sign beginning from its limit, which belongs neither to nature nor to convention. Now this limit of an impossible sign, of a sign giving the signified, indeed the thing, in person, immediately is necessarily closer to gesture or glance than to speech. A certain ideality of the sound behaves essentially as the power of abstraction and mediation. The movement of the wand is rich with all possible discourses, but no discourse can reproduce it without impoverishing and deforming it. The written sign is absent from the body, but this absence is already announced within the invisible and ethereal element of the spoken word, powerless to imitate the contact and the movement of the bodies. The gesture, that of passion rather than that of need, considered in its purity of origin, guards us against an already alienating speech, a speech already carrying in itself death and absence. That is why, when it does not precede the spoken word, it supplements it, corrects its fault and fills its lack. The movement of the wand is a substitute for all discourse that, at a greater distance, would substitute itself for it. This relationship of mutual and incessant supplementarity or substitution is the order of language. It is the origin of language, as it is described without being declared, in the essay on the origin of languages, which is here also in agreement with the second discourse. In both texts, the visible gesture, more natural and more expressive, can join itself as a supplement to speech, which is itself a substitute for gesture. This graphic of supplementarity is the origin of languages. It separates gesture and speech primitively united in the mythic purity, absolutely immediate and therefore natural, of the cry, the first language of mankind, the most universal and vivid, in a word the only language man needed, before he had occasion to exert his eloquence to persuade assembled multitudes, was the simple cry of nature. When the ideas of men began to expand and multiply, and closer communication took place among them, they strove to invent more numerous signs and a more copious language. They multiplied the inflections of the voice, and added gestures, which are in their nature more expressive, and depend less for their meaning on a prior determination. P 148, italics added, P 176. Gesture is here an adjunct of speech, but this adjunct is not a supplementing by artifice, it is a recourse to a more natural, more expressive, more immediate sign. It is the more universal the less it depends on conventions. 50 but if gesture supposes a distance and a spacing, a milieu of visibility, it ceases being effective when the excess of distance or mediation interrupts visibility, then speech supplements gesture. Everything in language is substitute, and this concept of substitute precedes the opposition of nature and culture. The supplement can equally well be natural, gesture, as artificial, speech. But, as hardly anything can be indicated by gestures, except objects actually present or easily described, and visible actions, as they are not universally in use for darkness or the interposition of a material object destroys their efficacy, and as besides they rather request than secure our attention, men at length bethought themselves of substituting for them the articulate sounds of the voice, which, without bearing the same relation to any particular ideas, are better calculated to express them all, as conventional institutes sign s. Such a substitution could only be made by common consent, and must have been effected in a manner not very easy for men whose gross organs had not been accustomed to any such exercise. It is also in itself still more difficult to conceive, since such a common agreement must have been motivated, and speech seems to have been highly necessary to establish the use of it. pp 148-49, italics added, pp 176-77. Speech excites attention, the visible exacts it. Is it because the ear is always open and offered to provocation, more passive than sight? One can more naturally close one's eyes or distract his glance than avoid listening. Let us not forget that this natural situation is primarily that of the child at the breast. This structure of supplementarity, reflexive, mutual, speculative, infinite, alone permits an explanation of the fact that the language of space, sight, and muteness, Rousseau New ALS 051 THAT it signified death, sometimes takes the place of speech when the latter is attended by a greater threat of absence and cuts into life's energy. In that case, the language of visible gestures is more alive. Love might also have invented speech, though less happily. Not being very well pleased with it, it disdains it, it has livelier ways of expressing itself. How she could say things to her beloved, who traced his shadow with such pleasure. What sounds might she use to work such magic? Essay, P6J. It is therefore after the invention of language and the birth of passion that desire, in order to recapture presence and according to the pattern I have identified, returns to the movement of the magic wand, to the finger and the eye, to a mutism charged with discourse. It is the question of a supplementary return toward a greater naturalness, not of an origin of language. Rousseau clarifies it further on by distinguishing gesture from gesticulation. The former, which sketches the shadow of presence, silently governs the first metaphor, the latter is an indiscreet and cumbersome adjunct of speech. It is a bad supplement. The silent language of love is not a paralinguistic gesture, it is a mute eloquence. Our European gestures merely indicate our natural unrest. It is not of those that I wish to speak. Only Europeans gesticulate when speaking, one might say that all their power of speech is in their ends. Their lungs are powerful too, but to nearly no avail. Holcray, a Frenchman, would strain and torture his body, emitting a great verbal torrent. A Turk will momentarily remove his pipe from his mouth to utter a few words softly, crushing one with a single sentence. Here the Turk is no longer, like his language, from the north, but from the Orient. WC are at once from the north and from the Occident. Essay, P6J. The value of the mute sign is also that of sobriety and discretion within speech, the economy of speech. Since learning to gesticulate, we have forgotten the art of pantomime, for the same reason that with all our beautiful systems of grammar we no longer understand the symbols of the Egyptians. What the ancients said in the liveliest way, they did not express in words but by means of signs. They did not say it, they showed it. Essay, P6J. What TEY showed was clearly not the thing but its hieroglyphic metaphor, the visible sign. This praise of Egyptian symbolism may surprise us, it is a praise of writing and a praise of savagery, more precisely of that writing of which we are told further along that it suits savages. Savagery does not characterize the primitive state of man, the state of pure nature, but rather the state of society being born, of the first language and the first passions. A state structurally anterior to the state of barbarism, itself anterior to civil society. In fact, in the chapter on script, 5, Egyptian hieroglyphs are defined as the most crude and most antique script. It would suit people assembled as a nation under the form of savagery, the cruder the writing, the more ancient the language. The primitive way of writing was not to represent sounds, but objects themselves, whether directly, as with the Mexicans, or by allegorical imagery, or as the Egyptians did in still other ways. This stage corresponds to passionate language, and already supposes some society and some needs to which the passions have given birth. The depicting of objects is appropriate to a savage people. Essay, pp 16-17. The hieroglyphic language is an impassioned language. Savagery holds itself closest to this passional origin of language. The paradox is that thus it also holds itself closer to writing than to speech. Because gesture, which elsewhere expresses need, here represents passion. It is writing not only because it traces, like the movement of the wand, a design in space, but because the signifier first signifies a signifier, and not the thing itself or a directly presented signified. The hieroglyphic graphy is already allegorical. The gesture which speaks before words did la parole avant les mots and which argues with the eyes, is the moment of savage writing. Consider ancient history, it is full of such ways of appealing to the eye, each of them more effective than all the discourse that might have replaced it. An object held up before speaking will arouse the imagination, excite curiosity, hold the mind in suspense, in expectation of what will be said. I have noticed that Italians and Provençals, among whom gesture ordinarily precedes discourse, use this as a way of drawing attention and of pleasing their listeners. But in the most vigorous language, everything is said symbolically, before one actually speaks. Tarquin, or Thrasybulus lopping off poppies, Alexander applying his seal to the mouth of his favorite, Diogenes promenading in front of Zeno, do they not speak more effectively than with words? What verbal circumlocution would express the same idea as well? 52, italics added. Essay, pp 6-7. How can the language of gesture or sight express passion here, and need elsewhere? The contradiction between these different texts responds to the unity of an intention and the necessity of a constraint. 1. Rousseau speaks the desire of immediate presence. When the latter is better represented by the range of the voice and reduces dispersion, he praises living speech, which is the language of the passions. When the immediacy of presence is better represented by the proximity and rapidity of the gesture and the glance, he praises the most savage writing, which does not represent oral representation, the hieroglyph. 2. This concept of writing designates the place of unease, of the Rego 238 Part 2, nature, culture, writing laid at incoherence within conceptuality, both beyond the essay and beyond Rousseau. This incoherence would apply to the fact that the unity of need and passion, with the entire system of associated significations, constantly effaces the limit that Rousseau obstinately sketches and recalls. Rousseau declares this backbone, without which the entire conceptual organism would break up, and wishes to think it as a distinction. He describes it as a supplementary difference. This constrains in its graphics the strange unity of passion and need. How does writing reveal it? How is writing, like pity, for example, both in nature and outside of it? Like the awakening of imagination before this, what does the awakening of writing signify here, if it belongs neither to nature nor to its other? Writing precedes and follows speech, it comprehends it. This is already true from the only point of view that concerns us here, that of the structure of the essay. On the one hand, the theory of writing follows the genealogy of speech and is proposed as a sort of supplementary appendix. Once one has described the passional origin of speech, one can accessorily consider that accessory which is writing, in order to draw from it some supplementary information about the state of languages. The entire chapter on script is opened and governed by this declared project. After having summarized the progress of languages and the movement of supplementarity and substitution which holds it to its law, one substitutes new articulations for accents that efface themselves, one substitutes ideas for sentiments, etc. Rousseau introduces a new development. Another way of comparing languages and determining their relative antiquity is to consider their script, and reason inversely from the degree of perfection of this art. 16. Yet writing had to appear even before there was a question of speech and its passional origin. The movement of the magic wand and the hieroglyph expressed a passion before the passion that draws out the primitive voices, and as writing will also be recognized as the language of need, it will have stated need before need. The first allusion to writing holds itself out of reach of all distinction, if not of all difference of need from passion. The advantage of writing requires a new conceptuality. The metaphoric origin of speech opens an eye, one might say, at the center of language. And the passion that draws out the first voices relates to the image. The visibility inscribed on the act of birth of the voice is not purely perceptive, it signifies. Writing is the eve of speech. That appears also from the first chapter. Darius, engaged, with his army in Scythia, receives from the king of Scythia a frog, a bird, a mouse, and 5 arrows. The herald makes the presentation in silence and departs. That terrible harangue was understood, and Darius returned to his own country as quickly as he could. Substitute a letter, namely, a phonetic script for the sign, the more menacing it is, the less frightening will it be. It will be no more than a boast, which would draw merely a smile from Darius. 53 essay, p7. And after another series of biblical and Greek examples, thus one speaks more effectively to the eye than to the ear. There is no one who does not feel the truth of Horace's judgment in this regard. Clearly the most eloquent speeches are those containing the most imagery, and sounds are never more forceful than when they produce the effects of colors. Italics added. Essay, p8. Decisive consequence, eloquence depends upon the image. What is already announced is that the first language had to be figurative, title of chapter 3. The metaphor within spoken language draws its energy from the visible and from a sort of oral picto-hieroglyphics. Now if one considers that Rousseau elsewhere associates visibility, space, painting, writing, etc., with the loss of passional energy, with need, and sometimes with death, one must surely decide within, the advantage of writing, in favor of the unity of heterogeneous or so declared values. But Rousseau cannot declare this unity of the advantage of writing. He can only describe it clandestinely as he plays with the different parts of his discourse. Even though he contradicts himself, he places writing on the side of need and speech on the side of passion. In the passage that we have just cited, it is clear that it is a question of passional signs. That will be confirmed further along when hieroglyphic script will be defined as impassioned language. Yet IF sounds never have more energy than when they make the effect OF colors. It is not that color or DHAT space as such which speaks to passion. Rousseau unexpectedly reverses the order of the demonstration. Only the spoken word has the power of expressing or exciting passion. But when it is a question of stirring the heart and inflaming the passions, it is an altogether different matter. The successive impressions of discourse, which strike a redoubled blow, produce a different feeling from that of the continuous presence of the same object, which can be taken in at a single glance. Imagine someone in a painful situation that is fully known. As you watch the afflicted person, you are not likely to weep. But give him time to tell you what he feels and soon he will burst into tears. It is so low in this way that the scenes of a tragedy produce their effect. Asterisk pantomime without discourse will leave you nearly tranquil, discourse without gesture will bring tears from you. The passions have. I have said elsewhere why feigned misfortunes touch us more than real ones. There is a type that weeps at a tragedy, yet has never had any pity for the suffering. The invention of theater is remarkable for inflating our pride with all the virtues in which we are entirely lacking. Essay, pp 8-9 Rousseau's footnote. Their gestures, but they also have their accents, and these accents, which thrill us, these tones of voice that cannot fail to be heard, penetrate to the very depths of the heart, carrying there the emotions they wring from us, forcing us in spite of ourselves to feel what we hear. We conclude that while visible signs can render a more exact imitation, sounds more effectively arouse interest. In this argument I have emphasized the two controlling strands. Right at first the sound touches us, interests us, emphasizes us all the more because it penetrates us. It is the element of interiority because its essence, its own energy, implies that its reception is obligatory. As we noted above, I can close my eyes, I can avoid being touched by the HAT which I see and that which is perceptible at a distance. But my passivity and my passion are totally open to accents to which one may not conceal one's organ, which penetrate through it to the bottom of one's heart, and carry there in spite of us the movements which draw them forth. Voice penetrates into me violently, it is the privileged route for forced entry and interiorization, whose reciprocity produces itself in the hearing oneself speak, in the structure of the voice and of interlocution. 54 This violence obliges Rousseau to temper the praise of passion and to suspect this complicity between voice and heart. Beauty and other violence complicates the scheme even more. Within the voice, the presence of the object already disappears. The self-presence of the voice and of the heading oneself speak conceals the very thing that visible space allows to be placed before us. The thing disappearing, the voice substitutes an acoustic sign for it which can, in the place of the object taken away, penetrate profoundly into me, to lodge there in the depth of the heart. It is the only way of interiorizing the phenomenon, by transforming it into acamine, which supposes an originary synergy and an originary synesthesia, but which also supposes that the disappearance of presence in the form of the object, the being before the eyes or being at hand, installs a sort of fiction, if not a lie, at the very origin of speech. Speech never gives the thing itself, but a simulacrum that touches us more profoundly than the truth, strikes us more effectively. Another ambiguity in the appreciation of speech. It is not the presence of the object which moves us but its phonic sign, the successive impressions of discourse, which strike a redoubled blow, produce a different feeling from that of the continuous presence of the same object. I have said elsewhere why feigned misfortunes touch us more than real ones. If the theater is condemned, it is thus not because it is, as its name implies, a place of spectacle, it is because it makes us hear and understand. Thus is explained the nostalgia for a society of need that Rousseau disqualifies so harshly elsewhere. Dream of a mute society, of a society before the origin of languages, that is to say, strictly speaking, a society before society. The essay and the origin of languages. This leads me to think that if the only needs we ever experienced were physical, we should most likely never have been able to speak. We would fully express our meanings by the language of gesture alone. We would have been able to establish societies little different from those we have, or such as would have been better able to achieve their goals. We would have been able to institute laws, to choose leaders, to invent arts, to establish commerce, and to do, in a word, almost as many things as we do with the help of speech. Without fear of jealousy, the secrets of Oriental gallantry are passed across the more strictly guarded harems in the epistolary language of salams. The mutes of great nobles understand each other, and understand everything that is said to them by means of signs, just as well as one can understand anything said in discourse. Essay, p9. With reference to the society of mute writing, the advent of speech resembles a catastrophe, an unpredictable misfortune. Nothing made it necessary. The end of the essay, this pattern is exactly inverted. Things are further complicated if one considers that the language of needs is a natural language and that it would be difficult to find a sure criterion for distinguishing between this mute society and animal society. One does then perceive that the only difference between what Rousseau wished to consider the fixity of animal language and the progressiveness of human languages is not dependent on any one organ, any one sense, is not to be found in either the visible or the audible order. It is once again the power of substituting one organ for another, of articulating space and time, sight and voice, hand and spirit. It is this faculty of supplementarity which is the true origin or non-origin of languages, articulation in general, as articulation of nature and of convention, of nature and all its others. This is what one must emphasize right from the close of chapter I. It appears again, by the same observations, that the invention of the art of communicating our ideas depends less upon the organs we use in such communication than it does upon a power proper to man, according to which he uses his organs in this way, and which, if he lacked these, would lead him to use others to the same end. Give man a structure organically as crude as you please, doubtless he will acquire fewer ideas, but if only he has some means of contact with his fellow man, means of which one can act and another can sense, he will finally succeed in communicating whatever ideas he might have. Animals have a more than sufficient structure for such communication, but none of them has ever made use of it. This seems to me a quite characteristic difference. That those animals which live and work in common, such as beavers, ants, bees, have some natural language for communicating among themselves, I would not question. There is even reason to think that the speech of beavers and ants is by gesture, i.e., it is only visual. If so, such languages are natural, not acquired. The animals that speak them possess them bombing, they all have them, and they are everywhere the same. They are entirely unchanging and make not the slightest progress. Conventional language is characteristic of man alone. Italics added. Animal language and animality in general represents here the still living myth of fixity, of symbolic incapacity, of non-supplementarity. If we consider the concept of animality not in its content of understanding or misunderstanding but in its specific function, we shall see that it must locate a moment of life which knows nothing of symbol, substitution, lack, and supplementary addition, etc. Everything, in fact, whose appearance and play I wish to describe here. A life that has not yet broached the play of supplementarity and which at the same time has not yet let itself be violated by it, a life without difference and without articulation.